today. As our listeners, our readers and community knows, we have been releasing recently this white paper. This white paper is essentially a piece of work that we started in January this year, 2020, and it was a companion for the most crazy year ever, and we just delivered it around the 20th of November. So you can also find on our website the release session where we clarify a bit more profoundly, I would say, the topics of the conversations that we have been running in the preparation of the release and the research. So Boundaryless, as you know, is missionized to explore the future of organizing and business model innovation. We create free tools and deliver workshops and trainings to this community. And essentially, we want to create these languages to explore the future of organizing in the complexity that is arising and at scale. So this is what we do. We do it through several tools. Essentially, we have this playbook. We created this open knowledge in Creative Commons. We try to abstract and modularize these ways to engage with the complexity of markets, society, organizations, and we have a very well-known, I would say, toolkit called Cross-Functional Design Toolkit. It's been published in 2013 for the first time. Now counts more than 80,000 users all over the world, and more tools are coming up in the last few years. And the latest to arrive has been the EEEO toolkit, which is dedicated to developing what we call entrepreneurial ecosystem enabling organizations. That's going to be a massive part, I think, of the conversation we're going to have today. So why the new white paper? Again, I'm going to be very quick. Essentially, since 2016, we have been releasing the first PDT Platform Design Toolkit 2.0 in 2016 with a companion white paper. And of course, in the last 4 years, as you may have noticed, so many things have been changing, or maybe we just started to notice better the change. And more specifically, in 2019, we really said, we need to lay down new foundations. And this is what we did with this paper. This paper tried to integrate platform thinking, so both in terms of organizational development, product design and development, with new aspects, with essential elements that we believe were very important to understand. So essentially, we have been mapping new risk factors, new organizational models, new product trends, and new technologies coming up. And we created this piece of work that tried to put everything together, essentially around, I would say, 3 main theses that are the ones that you can see here. And we're talking about essentially understanding how both the technological advancements and changes that we have been living through in the last decades connect and interact with the changes we are seeing in the biosphere, with all these issues that we are witnessing in terms of ecological, impacts or climate change, and all the changes that we are seeing, and the push, the new shift towards systemic health that we are, I would say, perceiving, as a response also to the pandemic that we have been living through in the last year. And on the other hand, the profound changes that are impacting our cultural sphere, our news sphere. So essentially, the ways that, for example, through social media, through social networks, we create a new governance modes, new modes to take decision making to the next level, and also the way that the politics is changing accordingly. So there's so many things that are changing, and this essentially impacts widely how we envision the organizational evolutions in the future. So I want to also thank quickly our sponsor, our main sponsor for the white paper, which was Intesa Sanpaolo from the very start. And also I want to thank all the early adopters, the people from our community that supported the project, not just in terms of showing up and participating, but also financially by buying these early adopters kits, these packages that allow them to be very much involved into the release process. And indeed, today we're going to have a Q&A in the last half an hour involving some of the people that have been participating as early adopters into the process. So thanks very much to everybody that showed up also here today, and looking forward to your questions later on in the conversation. So last bit, our guest, our amazing guest, I must say, I'm really excited to have you here, as I said already a couple of times. And I'm talking about these four amazing guests and our moderator for today, Emanuele Quintarelli. So let's start by our guests. Let's start from our guests. So today we have, as I said, Roberto Battaglia, head of HR corporate investment banking at Intesa Sanpaolo. And from our, we know each other since a lot of time, and Roberto has been really a great, I would say, weaver of the organization, or one that a person that has been always pushing the organization forward. And in our conversations, we have been debating, the new trends and the new possibilities very often. So Roberto, thanks for joining us. If you want to just say hello, you're on mute.
It's okay. Okay. Thanks for having me, Simone.
Thank you for coming. Then Dave Snowden. I think Dave doesn't need any strong introduction, I would say, especially to our community, because you have also been our recent guest in our podcast. But Dave is founder and chief scientific officer at Cognitive Edge and director of the I always have some hard times in pronouncing it, but Cynefin Center, Wales. And then and thanks again, Dave, if you want to say hello.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Thanks very much again. And then we have Lisa Gill. Lisa is as an organizational self-management coach and the founder of Reimaginaire, but also the host of Leadermorphosis, which is an amazing podcast that most of you, I guess, in the call today are familiar with, and also recently came up with an interesting book called, if I'm not wrong, Moose Heads on the Table, about progressive organizations. I must say that also Roberto just recently came out with a great book, Startupper in Azienda, which means how to make startups in corporate, essentially in corporate context. And Dave is coming up with a new book soon, if I'm not wrong. Dave, any idea on when it's going to be available?
It's the new European Union handbook on how to manage in a crisis, which I wrote. That will be out in a couple of weeks' time.
That's great. And also the team that works with Dave has just released a great book on the framework on Cynefin. Again, I'm sorry for pronouncing it in the wrong way, but it's a really great piece of work that you guys want to check it out. And finally, today we have also Sergio Caredda, who is a senior director of the human resources at and global digital transformation leader at VF Corporation. Sergio, thanks for being with us. If you want to say hello.
Thank you very much for hosting me today.
Thank you. You don't have any book coming up, as we said before in the preparation call. That's a pity, but when you have, we'll be sure to promote it during some kind of webinar, because it would be great for sure. You can, by the way, look at the Sergio blog, which is amazing and has a lot of information on organizational models, possibilities, and so on. Finally, before leaving the floor, today we have Emanuele Quintarelli that will be the host of this conversation. Emanuele is the micro enterprise lead at Boundaryless, that essentially is developing together with us, with all the team, but leading the development of the entrepreneurial ecosystem enabling organization toolkit and methodology that we are mutuating from our collaborations with companies such as Hire, but many others, and integrating the new ideas around how do you build really organizations that can deal with uncertainty and that can be entrepreneurial and ecosystemic in their shape. So Sorry for taking so much, because I feel like every minute that I take of this conversation is going to be less valuable than you guys. So thanks very much, Emanuele, and I leave it to you to run this quick conversation.
Thank you, Simone, and thanks to all of you for being with us. So let's get into the conversation. What Simone was sketching, I guess, is somehow the landscape that we are all observing. We are in the middle of a pandemic. We've been talking about complexity for decades, but we feel now that complexity is real. It's happening, it's impacting all our lives, but also all of our organizations. We are seeing a Cambrian explosion of new organizational models, self-management, self-governance. As employees, we are expecting something different from our organizations in terms of meaning, and Sergio has been writing about it, in terms of purpose, and more broadly, the role of business, especially corporates in society, is up for discussion, since we would like them to generate value, not just for shareholders, but for all of us, all the stakeholders. So in this context, my question for you is really, what is your perception of these patterns that we are seeing? So what do you think about that, about them, and what do you think is the level of awareness of our organizations about them? And just for those attending, basically we have two guests coming from a corporate environment, so representing a corporate perspective, and two guests bringing more the academia, consulting, research angle. So I'm very interested to see if the perspective that you have and you bring is the same. So I will just go around the table, the virtual table, quickly to pick your feedback, starting from Lisa, maybe.
I was dreading that you might say me first. I think it's interesting because I think my perception of, well, let me say something about the question around awareness, because I think, and it'll be interesting to hear what the other panelists think about this, but I'm always sort of shocked at, or not shocked, but sort of, it's interesting that people are, I don't think there's the readiness quite yet in organizations in terms of, one way of thinking about it is like, I think we are paradigm blind somewhat in the organizational world, that if organizations are trying to apply new models, new frameworks, like Agile is a classic example, or, the Spotify model, and everyone trying to sort of copy that. But I think underneath is sort of this paradigm, which is still kind of stuck in the industrial era. And so I think organizations aren't ready to kind of shift things yet, because they're kind of coming at it from the wrong place in terms of kind of apps and tools and processes and structures only, and not really addressing this sort of blind spot, I think, from which we're operating. So I think a lot of these trends and a lot of these shifts and this kind of increasing complexity and uncertainty landscape is sort of baffling to organizations, or they're sort of blind to a bigger context of how radical the shift is that's needed, I think.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me jump on the other side of the trench, maybe on the corporate angle. Let me pick Roberto, maybe. Roberto, you have been working on some of these topics within your organization, a huge organization, tens of thousands of people. And I guess the topic is not new at all. What's the level of awareness that you perceive in your organization, other organizations that you know about?
But in general, I'm not convinced that all the organizations in this moment are aware of the change that is taking place. And that especially for the most historical and structured ones that are still successful, and that they are often playing as incumbents. But I want to speak in general about the organization, having in mind, obviously, the situation of my company. But in general, talking about this awareness, I think that there are at least two reasons to take in account. The first is that a large part of these companies are, despite the pandemic, still prisoners of their success. And they are looking forward to a robust recovery after COVID-19, and not in particular considering the change in which we are. And the second reason is that a part of the organization I know don't fully understand the dynamics of the markets and the sector that are increasingly interconnected and increasingly hybrid. And I see that sometimes they tend to categorize the most advanced experience we are studying and go in depth as sort of fashion trends. I think that this is a dangerous behavior caused not only by a lack of technical knowledge about this phenomena, because it's a matter to go in depth and to be a little bit open and curious, but in particular by, let's say, myopia and lack of openness and diversity. I think that myopia plays a fundamental role within the organization, because it's composed of a poor ability to read phenomena, sometimes latent, that leads to underestimate the weak signals. They can become real threats. On the other hand, I think that the lack of openness, curiosity, and even, let's say, humility that comes from the position of strength, I think is a big risk today. And I think that within the organization now we need to feed and give space to critical thinking. This is, I think, really a precious dimension that is opposed to the idea of a single thought, because the organization in general are made of a pyramid, are in general top-down in terms of leadership. And I think feeding critical thinking is so important. Because we are aware that in general, the incumbency breeds complacency. And I think that to deal with it and to deal with risk, we must increase diversity as a general dimension, in particular to open the door to a different point of view that is made up of a lot of things, different people with different types of skills, different types of mindset. I think this is a huge richness we have to feed in the companies.
Thank you, Roberto. And then I would like to go to Dave. Dave, with your domains of complexity in the Canadian, has it anything to do with our being blind as organizations and not being able to read? If what Lisa and Roberto just said is true, what is happening? Are we really equipped to do that?
Okay, so I mean, there's some basic lessons we can pull from the past year, right? Where you get a massive disruption to the ecosystem, whether it's a biological ecosystem or an industry ecosystem, whoever was the previous dominant predator doesn't survive because they're over-optimized for the previous regime. And they actually don't see it coming. What you actually see is something highly small and energy efficient displaces them. And you can see this at a micro level. If you look at the way that Microsoft replaced IBM and then Apple replaced Microsoft, yeah, it wasn't a major competitor. It was somebody completely left field. Right? And you can see that in ecosystems. So when the meteor hits the earth and wipes out the dinosaurs, it's not the shark or the crocodile, it's the first mammal. So there's a whole body of, sorry, this is on my mind, but let's just finish writing this up for the European Union handbook on how the hell do you transform after a crisis. One of the key things to understand is that you've got a path-dependent system which has suffered actually catastrophic failure. So you're not going to be able to go back. So there's some big systems we can already see. Neoliberalism is dead. It's not working, right? In fact, the homogenization of neoliberalism reduced the energy cost of populism. Because the dominant parties were no longer seen as different, it doesn't take much for a Trump or a Boris to actually come in left field. So the energy costs of new entry go down during periods of disruption or homogenization. Right? So that's kind of like one key thing. Something new is going to come and we don't know what it is, right? And we got no idea. And large companies are actually in a good place to do something about that, but they don't. And you know, this is called the Kodak moment, because you remember Kodak invented digital photography, but their economic interests were so tied into chemicals that they couldn't make the switch, as a result of which they suffered catastrophic failure. The whole of the market research industry and the polling industry is in the same state, because their entire methodology is inductive. So they're assuming repetition of stable patterns. Well, you're now in an environment where there's no repetition, there's no stable pattern. So you have to switch to abductive thinking. And none of them are geared up for that. In fact, most of them probably don't even know what the word think means. Yeah. So I think there's that sort of paradigm shift, everything changes. I think the other thing to be aware of is behaviors that you get in a crisis don't survive after the crisis is over, or if the crisis goes on too long. And people are getting this wrong. I mean, the stress of working from home is, I mean, we got a mental health plague coming from January when people realize this is going to go on for another year. All right. And just to be pessimistic, this is not the worst plague I'm going to see in my lifetime. And I'm 66. There's far worse coming. Right? And the stress levels are going to go through the roof, and the medical systems can't cope with it. We're already seeing teenage male suicides going up in Europe and the US, and that's a classic early indicator. And so people aren't thinking about that and the consequences. And if you know some of the neurobiology of this, for example, one of the reasons that Zoom doesn't work very well, except as a temporary medium, is pheromones, a very large part of how we determine whether we trust what somebody says or not. Yeah, actually how you smell makes a difference to perception. And anybody who speaks will know that. If you're in a live audience, it's different than a static audience. Yeah. So we're going to have to think of ways in which we combine virtual and physical, probably from October, November next year, because not until October, November, are you really going to be able to travel. Yeah. And remember, we still don't know whether the vaccine will last for more than a year, or whether it's a flu vaccine and it will require constant mutation and change. And if you don't know the figures, it takes 18 months to vaccinate the world. Yeah, I mean, that's how long it takes if you actually look at the numbers, right? And there's some weird stuff on COVID. So, for example, we know it hits Neanderthal genes more than non-Neanderthal genes. So that's one of the reasons why Europe is suffering quite badly, because there's a high Neanderthal DNA presence where there's none in places like Korea. And that explains why they didn't get the same sort of incidence. So we're getting viruses that target genetic weaknesses, and that's going to increase. So I think the future on this, and I think this is kind of like one of the big things we've got to start thinking about. And I'll come back to something the previous speaker said. You need diversity of response. I mean, the case I always give people on this, and it's bears repetition, is if you gave radiologists a batch of x-rays, and on the final x-ray, you asked them to look for anomalies. And on the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla in plain sight, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of radiologists don't see it. Yeah, even though their eyes scan it, right? We do not see what we do not expect to see. We're scanning 3 to 40% of available data before we make very quick decisions. Now, the good news is there's a lot out there that if we could find ways to scan it, would give us opportunities that we're not seeing. And so probably the single biggest recommendation in the European Union handbook, just finished a whole section on it, is you need to set up human sensor networks. You need culturally, experientially, educationally diverse sensor networks, because somebody out there is seeing gorillas and you're not paying attention to it. And there's a whole methodology and technique around that. And that comes from our work on counterterrorism before and after 9/11 on weak signal detection. Yeah, the things that after the event you realize were significant. The second thing, which is critical, and this is called adaptation in biology, or radical repurposing. Under conditions of stress, traits which evolve for one function exapt to something completely different. Now, I can go into this more detail later if you want, but the key thing in a crisis is to map what you already know how to do and find out how to repurpose it for things you didn't think you would have to face. You can't invent from scratch. Yeah? And there's all sorts of issues about how you do niche construction on that, which are available to taught. And I think the final thing, because I've spoken too long, is governments have suddenly realized they can control people again. And that means they can control industry. If you look at the monopoly moves on Facebook and things like that. So the day, I say, this comes back to my point about neoliberalism and free market capitalism, it ain't worked very well for most people. And post-COVID, it's no longer sustainable. No? And that means industry is going to have to rethink its relationship with government. And the industries that radically rethink that relationship first are the most likely to survive.
Thank you, Dave. Let me go to Sergio to close this first round. So, is there anything we can do in this, let's say, 8 months, in the best case, probably a bit more in the worst case, and to what extent our organizations, based on your perspective, of course, equipped to sense, let's say, employees to sense, but also potentially to react or to probe, as Dave may say, this environment in which we are living, and yes, this uncertainty we are immersed into.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because the big challenge, if we come to the original question of the awareness as an organization, is that organizations are simply structured the way I see it, not for awareness. I've been running a couple of questions to friends and colleagues around different organizations, asking them how often they have been doing a new budget this year in their organization. And if you think about that, in such a period of disruption like the one that COVID has brought through, the entire concept of the budget process, which is we look back and we try to project something in the future simply does not make sense. Yet in many organizations, what I heard is that there have been rebudgeting processes for months, one after the other. And this is just like, probably it's part of our standard operating procedure in our organization. It's part of our routines. It's part of, but it's just not working. And I think that today a lot of leaders and executives in organization have started really to understand that this is not working, but what is the alternative? One of the problems, I think, with awareness is that if I go back in the years where a lot of this disruption was not felt, because let's face it, in certain industries, the disruption has not been felt, or at least it was slow coming through. We have been talking for years about digital transformation, but many industries saw this pretty slow coming. And I agree, yes, there is an ex-incumbent off the edge, but by definition, you don't see it because it is off the edge. And one of the problems is that a lot of the research, especially of what has been developed often in the academic content, in the academic areas, very often is not made available for or made accessible for companies and executive in organization. You know that a few items, a few elements that have been disrupting the way organizations are working, like sustainability, for example, which is a hot topic today, have become so they've made it on the agenda of the CEOs because somebody has made it possible to transform them into the so-called elevator pitch, so that people can now understand what it is about. And we have been able to link it with the, of course, with economic results, the financial results of organization. One of the things that I think we have learned through the pandemic with, this remote work experiment, which has probably been the largest really technology adoption experiment we ever had, is that we've really switched in terms of thinking about, well, digital transformation. We had plans to implement Teams in or other software solution always measured in terms of 18 months, and we managed to make it in 1 week or even less. This has also created an awareness, and it's very interesting what David was mentioning about these human-centered networks. Now, of course, I think behind the topic he was mentioning, there is a lot of research and a lot of content, but for me, one of the interesting aspects is that we have started inside our organization to understand that we have huge networks, okay, of people in our organization, thinking especially of the frontline workers in our stores. VF has more than 1,000 stores worldwide with a lot of people that work there, and they actually are sensing the environment a lot better than, of course, the few leaders that are in our head offices. The question is, how do we work through creating, these senses is, as somebody already mentioned before, they're in the form of weak signals. So how do we read that so that we really prevent that Kodak moment that David also mentioned in before? The entire concept of adaptive thinking is complicated to put it in place in organization that, again, if you think about our standard operating procedure being a budgeting process, which is looking in the back, which is really looking like without the possibility to look beyond what has happened in the past on something that any probably 5 years old student of mathematics can demonstrate it, it's wrong today, but we're still victim a little bit also of the success of that element. And I think that the last part that we need to think of, and David is right that the neoliberalism movement is probably in crisis, definitely has created issues, and we're seeing that today also in this pandemic. However, there is still a set of external rules and a lot of incentives, and I'm talking about how financial markets are rewarding organization, etc., that if we don't go and address those, it's also difficult to change the behavior of those people that then take the decision. And I think that is one of the elements that I think we need to think of. Emanuele mentioned it before. I have been, for example, researching a bit the concept of the meaning of work in this element, and the pandemic has been accelerating a lot of us with, moving back home, etc., etc. But one of the problems is that a lot of organization, and also in terms of human-centered management, we could be a lot forward in a lot of the decisions around this, but there are legal requirements around this that make it a nightmare. Just an example, I'm working out of the Swiss headquarters of VF Corporation, which is managing our international practice. We do have a lot of cross-border workers. Now, if you think about remote work in a cross-border situation, it just makes it impossible because there are so many fiscal regulations that are linked to where you're seated officially, that a lot of these external burdens make it complicated, really, the problem of adapting also as an organization.
Thank you, Sergio. Let's try to do one more step. I think the issues or the challenges that we are facing are pretty clear. And still, I agree with Sergio. Probably I don't hear enough pressure. And that's crazy because maybe this year has been the most, challenging year of the last few decades. So we switched to remote working in one night. Unfortunately, many people lost their life. So at the end, I don't know what else we need for realizing that this is an inflection point. And I'm still hearing a lot of talking about agile, mostly at the team level, imposed top-down, lots of talk about digital transformation. We've been hearing that for decades. So what is needed and what can we do? And now I will ask you to jump the next level, so to be as concrete as possible in your answers, to empower our organizations to leverage this time as an opportunity, paradigm shift. Somebody was mentioning, we don't see the paradigm, the shift in paradigm. Probably we are in that inflection point. So what can we do? What must we do right now to make this happen and to avoid wasting this opportunity? Again, I would like to go around, starting from Lisa, please. If you want to, I know, Lisa, you have lots of experience into. So what would you suggest to your clients or the organizations you are working with to take advantage, to try to thrive, to become, I don't know, anti-fragile, I would want to call it at this time?
Yeah, well, I think, as I said, like the first thing is to realize that we're in a paradigm. So when I'm doing trainings with people, that's kind of the first step. It's like we're in a paradigm. You could call it like a parent-child paradigm in terms of like how we relate to each other in organizations and in institutions generally, I think. So the first step is to realize, to have the awareness we're in a paradigm, and that gives us our behavior, it gives us everything. So I think the shift that's needed is really to become aware of how disempowering we are. So it doesn't work. And I think we're seeing this all the time with organizations that are trying to try on these new trends of things. But if your way of relating to people is still parent-child, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter what structures and processes you implement. It's going to be stuck. So an example that I came across recently that I really liked was I was interviewing the founder of an amazing organization called Jaipur Rugs, which is an organization with 40,000 weavers in India. And they're kind of networked across 600 villages. And N.K. Chowdhury is this remarkable man, and he invented this, all of the managers in the organization, although they're working towards being self-managing, but they go through what he calls a higher school of unlearning. So they're very kind of explicit about, like, we need to unlearn all of the habits and all of the stuff that we have inherited from education, from workplaces, in terms of how we relate to people. So how I relate or how I see people, like, profoundly influences how they show up or not. So I hear a lot of leaders saying, yeah, I'm empowering, and yeah, we're self-managed. But there's so many things that we do that we're totally blind to. So it's, I think, a good starting point is to accept, to acknowledge, I'm totally disempowering in so many ways that I don't even know, that is sort of stopping the potential of people around me, that's stopping, you know, new ideas and wisdom and creativity coming from all over the organization. So I think, you know, I was talking to a researcher recently who said he'd studied an organization where they had some teams implemented self-managing structures, a version of holacracy, I think, and then the rest of the organization didn't, and they wanted to measure the difference. And the difference was negligible. It was barely kind of existent. So then it brings up this interesting question of, like, what is it then? You know, because introducing these new models is not enough, it seems. So what are the skills? What's the kind of mindset shift that we need to support people with, and how do we do that? And it's not going to be done in some kind of, you know, 2-hour e-learning module or something. You know, it's a paradigm shift, and that's a very different thing. So I think starting from that place, a very kind of human, kind of humble place, is really important.
Thank you. Yeah, we stick to looking at organizations and structures and then designing them and imposing frameworks, when without that shift that you are mentioning, there is not much value to derive. Maybe I would like to connect this to some of Dave's thinking here. Dave, you talk a lot about constraints, and you talk a lot about skeletons, right? What's the connection here? So what can we do from an organizational perspective to really empower this flourishing?
Okay, so the first thing you don't do is to adopt something that somebody else has done that you like the look of. I mean, this is the fundamental error on thing like the Spotify model, and Spotify will tell you they don't have a model. It's just what they're currently doing. Yeah, and the whole point is Spotify lived a journey to get to that point. Yeah, and I think this is also where, I mean, holacracy is just a complete and utter bureaucratic nonsense. It always has been, right? And I know Brian who did it, and Brian is kind of like classic IT. He doesn't like to take responsibility for judgment, so he's written a program which avoids anybody ever having to take any responsibility for anything. And as a result of which, Zappos have to fire a third of their staff to get people to comply with it. I mean, these sort of things are just farcical, right? And they're pumped by the consultancy industry. So the whole of the agile movement at the moment, you know, something is at the end of its life cycle when, you know, IBM adopted a strategic, or the big 6 consultancies start to sell it. Because their whole industry model is based on a new fad every 2 to 3 years, which requires you to throw out everything and start again in favor of some wonderful visionary future, right? And we just got to stop that. It's been going on for 30, 40 years, and now it's a total disaster. Yeah, there was nothing wrong with process re-engineering for manufacturing. We just tried to do it for everything, and it failed. Right? So this is a concept called bounded applicability. Different things work in different systems. So in a slight disagreement with Leah, there is actually a time when you do actually get to be a dictatorial dictator manager. There's times when that's valid and there's times when they're not. Yeah. I mean, I've seen people write these leadership books and try and leverage different leaders from different backgrounds into them. I mean, you can take Steve Jobs from Apple, yeah. You can take Lou Gerster from IBM, and you can take, oh God, I always forget his bloody name, the guy from GE, yeah. Oh, famous, all right. Now, I've been personally screamed at by all three of those. In the case of Steve Jobs, had a pile of books thrown at me, which I'm quite proud of, right? The only common thing they had is they were arrogant bastards who didn't tolerate dissent, right? Everything else that is in the leadership books is just complete farce. It's kind of like retrospective coherence. So we kind of like got to stop that, I think, right? And one of the key principles on complexity, and I'm now coming back to the answer you prompted me to do, so I'm going to give it, all right? One of the things you understand when you take an ecological systems point of view is that you can't predict the future state. So the only thing which is certain about a complex adaptive system is that anything you do will have unintended consequences. Now, once you know that, that means you're ethically responsible for them. Now, you might not be able to predict the actual thing, but you know if you intervene in a complex adaptive system, something is going to happen which you couldn't anticipate, and you've got to be prepared for that. Right? So that's kind of like one principle. The other is that goal-based approaches are actually quite dangerous because people focus on the goal and therefore they miss opportunities on the path. And if you take that at a low level, we know from all available research without any exception whatsoever that when people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. Yeah, that's just a universal. I can give you the reference for the meta-study and everything, right? And where do we most need intrinsic motivation? Health, social services, education. Where do we have the most amount of targets? Okay. So the sort of key principle on this is you start journeys with a sense of direction rather than trying to achieve goals. That's kind of like the strategic focus, which means you have to understand where you are at the moment. And the trouble with all of these consultancy-led strategy exercises is nobody starts with where people are. They start with visions of where they think they should be. Then they try and close the gap. And it's the wrong way around. You need to start and work out what are the affordances of the current ecosystem in which you're in, i.e. which pathways are even possible for you to take. And then you have to work out which of those pathways are coherent, i.e. they have some possibility of producing a good outcome. And then you have to explore them and be aware of weak signals as you go. Yeah? And it is actually really simple to involve the whole of your workforce as a sensor network. Yeah? But the key thing is you never ask them direct questions. A sensor network is to give you attitudes and beliefs, not to give you answers. And this is one of the big issues on participative budgeting, which is where we also need to go, which is dynamic reallocation of resources. And you don't do that by voting for where the money should go, because then people will game the system. You do it by mapping the attitudes of the workforce about what they find valuable or invaluable, and then you start to allocate the funds based on those pathways. So there's reasonably well-established software technology-enabled ways of doing that. I mean, I've been working on for the past 15 years, right? But you start, and the other thing, and this is kind of like come out of 3 years work we've done on a complexity approach to design thinking. Because design thinking is another one of these things which has become commodified to the point where it's a waste of time. If I see that bloody double diamond and somebody wants to run an ideation workshop once more, I shall go kicking and screaming into the bushes, right? We look at distributed ideation and distributed ethnography, and we also look at mapping existing capability against unarticulated need. And actually the ability to take what you already know and use it to meet a need that people didn't know they have is how you change markets and how you survive. And that's a process called exaptive innovation, and there are structured methods to achieve that. Okay? And again, that's all. And the other big thing which came out of our work there is the concept that you don't design a final form. What you actually do is design scaffolding. And scaffolding can be internal or external. So an insect has an exoskeleton, we have an endoskeleton. With an exoskeleton, you've got certainty, the boundaries are clear, but there's a limitation on growth and there's no variety. With an endoskeleton, there's no limitation on growth and there's massive variety, though there is a coherent form. You can also have things like, and I'll give the metaphor, a micronutrient lattice, which basically dissolves as the body grows around it. It drives nutrient into it, so it disappears as you go forward. So the modern approach to organizational design into markets is very simple. It's you decide what the level of uncertainty is, you choose the scaffolding, you design the scaffolding, and then you design how people and technology interact around the scaffolding. And you monitor for emergent patterns and you reinforce the good ones and disrupt the bad ones. Yeah. Now, to give an illustration on that, one of the things we're doing at the moment, this is a mental health project. It's just starting the first big tests on this in Florida. And just to say something up front, the way we actually work is it's more like physics, which is my background. We do the mathematics and then we get the experimentalists to see what works. So our approach is to start with natural science, develop methods and tools consistent with natural science, and then revise them in practice. What we don't do is derive things from cases. Because the minute you use cases, you're subject to the confusion of correlation with causation. You haven't got a big enough sample size. And if everything is shifting, the cases are bad anyway, because they relate to past practice, not current practice. So our approach, which is called Naturalizing Sensemaking, is to say, what do we know about systems? What do we know about human cognition? What do we know about distributed sense making? What do we know about olfactory aspects of decision making? So we get that stuff assembled. And then we put methods and tools which are consistent with that scientific framing. Yeah? Now, one of the things we're working on at the moment is based on a metaphor of mitochondrial fungi, which, if you don't know it, if you look at trees in the field, then their root systems are connected by the root systems as fungi. And the root systems of the fungi actually extend 500 times the root system of the trees. It's a symbiosis. And the fungus provides water and nutrients to the tree that it couldn't reach for itself in return for sucrose. Now, in an organization, the informal network is the fungus and the trees are the formal system. And the original work I did on this in IBM, which gave rise to Cynefin, and now we're formalizing, is you actually focus on building the informal network and allowing the formal system to evolve from that, rather than starting by designing the formal system. And I blogged on this, so you can actually see the method. I put it in the public domain a couple of days ago. One of the big things we're working on at the moment is what are called entangled trios. So if I give you the public health aspect of this, we put the teacher together with a pupil, together with a parent. So that's one trio. This is looking at home isolation, and they're recording stories as journalists, they're interacting with each other, and those stories are spreading horizontally with other trios. And of course, a teacher is in a trio with several parents. But then we put the teacher in a trio with social workers and health workers, and the health workers in a trio with a social worker and the police. So if you've got 50 or 60 roles, you end up defining trio relationships. And you actually get people to work on projects. This is one of the ways you create a human sensor network related to how you survive in the future and the future. And the formal roles around which the trios work are links into the formal system. So those are the points of coherence. Yeah? Now, I'm just giving you an example of one technique. We're building that at the moment to build resilience into the system for the mental health problems. Because if we can increase peer-to-peer support and peer-to-peer micro-narrative exchange, and we can do two things. One is we can make people aware they're not alone, and that's important. Yeah, so we remove isolation. But also the nodes into the informal network can deploy the formal system's capabilities early rather than waiting for them to present late. So, I mean, I've been through a few things here. This stuff is actually not very difficult. The trouble is, it's rather like what happens when science goes through a revolution. It's kind of like, it's actually suddenly very simple, but it's not the way you expected it to be. So it seems all too difficult, right? But so human sensor networks, informal network management, managing the present, what's called shifting to the adjacent possible, vector theories of change. These are all really simple common sense things to adopt, but we're stuck in this engineering paradigm, which requires us to design the future and construct a machine to go towards it. And it's not going to work. And just to throw one final thing on this, I had the great privilege of teaching leadership with Peter Drucker. which kind of like saved me in IBM when there were people conspiring to have me fired. They went in to see Lou Gerstner just after he got a brochure inviting him to a invitation-only seminar with one of his staff with Peter Drucker. So it sort of, played back a bit on them that time. But one of the things Peter and I agreed on, well, there were two interesting things. I asked him mischievously in one group what he thought the role of consultants were. And I knew the answer because we discussed it over dinner. And he said, the consultant is meant to be a butterfly. They're meant to fly around and pollinate. The day they do the work for you, you've lost. And all the big consultancies at the moment, they want to do the work for you. They've missed that point. Their role is to be a pollinator, not to take over your practice in that sense. So that's one kind of like thing, I think. The other thing which we both agreed on, which I think is important, is that actually people should stop being negative about Taylorism. Scientific management did us really well until the 80s. And then we went into systems thinking and cybernetics, and that's when it went wrong. If you actually go back to scientific management, it still had apprentice models of leadership development. It didn't have wide income disparities. It didn't have 5-year plans. I still find it ironic that American capitalism adopts a planning cycle of Soviet Russia, but never mind, right? It just sort of, to be honest, it often muddled through and it had apprentice models. And we're trying to get back to that at the moment on an ecological model. We're saying you can't have somebody do a BA in business studies, an MBA, go into a big consultancy company and then come in and be a chief executive officer of a company. It doesn't work because they've got no experience. So they can only manage by spreadsheets. So there's a lot we can do, which is common sense and simple. But we've had this 20 or 30 years of the engineering paradigm dominating the way we think. And that really goes back to the early domination of cybernetics from the 80s.
Wow, that's I think that's a bit to digest here.
You did that.
Thank you. Lots of provocations as well, but very good food for thought. Let me just close this round first with Sergio and then with Roberto. So again, Sergio, what's your take on things we should do, things we could attempt, things that could bring us outside from or to make us a bit better able to face this moment? What are you trying?
So it's very difficult to speak immediately after David because I've been scribbling a couple of notes on my post-its and I already threw at least 15 of those as he was speaking on concepts or putting certain concepts in with already a name and a surname, because that has been really a beautiful hearing at the moment. And thank you very much for this, because, for example, one of the big things that we have been discovering in our organization, and this is very practical, I think it's a very practical advice, is the fact that we have been addressing the issue of innovation, okay, for the past 10 years at least, especially through consultants, I agree, but also within organization, as if it was an issue of creativity. So all organizations have been trying to develop methodologies, and design thinking is just one of those, but elements to be more creative. But the reality is that innovation is present in our organization. Again, if I make just example of our store network or our distribution center network, etc., if you go and ask one of our frontline workers about practical innovations that could speed their work, that could make their work better, or that could satisfy our customer, you're going to get huge ideas. The problem is that we don't have a way to make sense of this, to listen to this, okay, and to drive them on our pipeline in terms that somebody then takes a decision, because the innovation process is top-down and not bottom-up. And I think this is a very practical element. And I think that, and I agree, we need to find our own way of doing it, because also here, adopting one model, we try things out. You take a crowdsourcing methodology and you try, but you understand it doesn't work because maybe it doesn't fit your culture, etc., etc. So this would be a first advice. A second one is to get away from the idea that there is a best practice. That is probably one of the most problematic issue that I think, the fact that for everything, whether it's a process optimization or an organizational model, etc., there is one best practice. There are a lot of good practice. There are a lot of things that each has their positive and negative aspect. And we need to look at the one that is most applicable to the situation, more efficient and more effective. And we need to look at the efficiency and effectiveness element together, jointly. I'm not one of those that says, oh, we can completely abandon the efficiency, because you still need the resources to go towards being effective, but you need to have both elements, and again, this is probably what David was mentioning as a consulting mindset. And I actually had some years of experience in one of the big 5 consulting firms. And I know that very often the intentions are good, but the practice about also how to sustain that business model lead to problematic ways of working. And the concept of the best practice is one of those, which leads to the fact that another practical element, we need to abandon the idea that in general there are global universal truth about how to run a business, how to act in an industry, how to manage a channel, etc., etc., etc. And I'm really defining elements around this, like leadership is at the top, we need to manage by channel, we need to have a yearly budget cycle. I really liked what Dave mentioned about goal system, because I think that if you ask most managers and employees in an organization beyond the first initial question, they will all find something wrong in the traditional performance management system that we have in organization. Yet we all assume that the idea of having, whether you call it MBO or in the new rebranding OKR, it's something that can be dangerous. And again, by the way, there are organizations that both with the MBOs of the past and OKR now have been doing incredibly well to orient the practice and also to drive motivation. But normally that's because it's team adoption, it's self-commitment around this, etc. The moment that you take that, you create a best practice and you take something that you want to apply outside, that's where it doesn't work anymore. And I think the last point, and I think this is the big teaching that we need to consider now, is that we should be questioning the concept of growth, of what it means always trying to grow as an organization in the numbers of people, in terms of size, by acquisition, etc., etc. They all make sense in isolation, okay? But we need to question, do we always need to grow? And one of the problems is probably the problem with growth has also been, how did we measure that growth so far? Because it has always been just a financial element. And I think that this goes to one of the points, and it was very interesting what, again, David was mentioning about this idea of creating or thinking in terms of a skeleton and the way you build it, so that you can actually, especially the internal skeleton element, that would actually make a lot of sense to be able to capture opportunities along the way. One of the good things, again, is that we do already have internal networks in our organization. We do already have projects. We do already have pockets of excellence everywhere. The point, and very often these are the driving energies of organization, even if the drag, the areas where bureaucracy, where inefficiencies are still reigning. The question is, how do we translate? How do we create the mechanism to make this really working for the entire organization and drive the wealth that we want to do for the people that are working inside and outside? Because then today, every organization is anyway a network, and we need to recognize this.
Thank you. Roberto, what's your take on this?
I think really interesting thoughts. I think that in taking this direction we are talking about, I think we have to take in account an element. This is the cultural resistance, because we are aware that even if we design a really good innovation funnel or new agile structures, we have to be aware that change is never easy, because we think in general that each of us need enlightened entrepreneurs and enlightened CEOs and managers to lead these transitions. But above all, the managers that are able to take the risks to do simply counterintuitive things. And but there are not always the conditions in terms of a cultural condition to do this, because as I said before, when the company are still successful, and they are often victims of the so-called immunity to change and the bureaucratic approach that prevents change from being made with the agility of a startup, I think we have a problem. And the question is, I think, what can we do waiting for these enlightened CEOs? I think that in this situation, it's necessary to start from, first of all, creating the cultural condition, but not only delivering leadership workshops or something like this, or workshop of design thinking or something like this, but in particular, making space for the free flow of thoughts, making space, let's say, for the restless, for the unrulies. And I'm aware that talking about that, working in a financial institution is quite difficult. But I wanted to say that, in particular, from an intellectual point of view. Why I say that? I think that this huge deposit of potential in terms of not only innovation, but different thoughts is so important. And in that, the HR function of the company have a huge responsibility in leveraging these capabilities that are often hidden capabilities. And doing that, I think it's important to launch initiative, even if sometimes we have to label this initiative, for instance, as development, as people development, but we have to design, I think, movement of thoughts. That beyond this revolutionary meaning, I think have the purpose of preparing the organization to be more hierarchical, more liquid, more mobile, in particular when the organization is regulated, because there are a lot of industries that are so regulated that we have to be prudent, we have to be risk averse, we have obviously to respect the rules, but giving space to the restless, facilitating these movements, making room for the, let's say, ethical guerrillas. I think that beyond this provocation, it's important because this could prepare the transition. This could prepare the element to design really a really good change. I call them territories of expressions, as I wrote in my book. And as I said, at the end of the day, we have to link to a dimension that I think is fundamental, that is the entrepreneurial mindset. That is the object of the book I wrote, because these entrepreneurial mindset can't be taught in a traditional manner, can be learned only by studying, but only by trying and failing and try again. We have huge responsibilities, as I said, as manager and as HR professionals, because we have day by day not only doing what we have to do within the organization, because sometimes we are guardians of the rules, that's inevitably. But sometimes we have a little bit instigators of this potential, because I think this is the large part of the future organization, a part of the enlightened CEOs or manager we need.
Thank you. So I would like to ask you a very last question, if possible, to get a quick answer. So just going around the table, but with a quick answer. Sergio was questioning growth. Actually, I would like to question the role of business overall. So my question for you is, what the final outcome of this evolution? I don't believe this is transformation. There is no transformation from A to B. What's the and the result? What should be this result in terms of the role of the business? So at the end, are we expecting to still have businesses just trying to maximize shareholder value, regardless of what the business roundtable may be saying or the lip service we may be paying as businesses? or eventually this looking at organizations as ecosystems, we talk about ecosystems, we talk about platforms, will eventually mean that the role of the business will be something else. And if that's the case, what? Maybe let me choose another order. So let me start with Sergio, and then go to Lisa again. Sergio,
Yes.
to talk about meaning. So
Yes.
I think you have something to say here.
Yeah, and thank you for the question, because I think this is one point which is also what I truly think is a big source of hope. Okay, we have talked up until now of a lot of difficulties, but the reality is that in some organization there is already conscience that we are not anymore just working for the shareholders, but we have a deeper impact. And I think that what you have observed by many organizations, VF, for example, has been working in the past 2.5 years on becoming a purpose-oriented organization. And I understand that a lot of people still have doubts about this, because it is a big change to move from a shareholder-only approach to something broader than that. But I think I just want to mention a couple of elements. Think about how much many organizations have done on the topic of diversity and inclusion, okay? Sometime more than what has been happening in the countries. We're seeing that at the moment in Poland and Hungary, for example, here in Europe, where governments are taking different decisions and the businesses are standing somehow as one last step around that. Or what some organizations have been doing on the concept of sustainability, for example, in the world of fashion, the industry, the apparel is the second most polluting industry in the world. Okay, so for us, the big topic of creating circularity in terms of circular economy, it's something very important. And I think that also here, I noticed how important has been actions, which sometimes are not advertised outside, but about providing basic healthcare in Bangladesh or in countries like this. So concrete actions that are possible. I think this is, to say in short, something that for the business, it is still an important role, but it is about their understanding their position in the network where they belong to. So I think this is the point that makes a big difference today. Somebody has called it now multi-stakeholder capitalism. I don't want to give it a label, but this direction, I think it's a big learning that something is possible.
Thank you, Sergio. Lisa.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm really inspired by organizations that are where almost, the product or the service that they produce is sort of irrelevant. And actually the organization exists to be kind of a playground for human development and flourishing. So like Jaipa Rugs is an example that I mentioned before. And another one that I like is Beetroot, which is an IT social impact company in Ukraine. And the founders, they just picked something, but really it's become a sort of a way for them to make an impact and to sort of practice developing together. And I think one thing that I want to sort of get across in this conversation, what I'm passionate about is that I really like what, Margaret Wheatley talks about. And there's this great quote in this book by Diane Mushu Hamilton that relationships are our evolutionary assignment. And I think a lot of what's needed in this new landscape, and Dave, talks and writes about this, that I think something like how things connect is more important than what they are. And I think we need to develop our muscle in relationships and relating to each other, and kind of, what Dave calls creating intimacy in the system, connecting people and informal networks, connecting the spider web to more of itself. And I think that then becomes more important than sort of short-sighted goals. I mean, what is the point in kind of limitless scale if there's no planet left at the end of it? So I was speaking to Frederic Laloux recently, and he was interviewing or doing a workshop with CEOs in Brazil and asking them, where are you out of integrity? And they were sitting with some really heavy stuff about like, wow, I'm the CEO of a fashion company, and it doesn't sit well with me that, that our advertising is really sexist and kind of violent towards women, or that our company is really contributing to the destruction of the planet. So starting with these big questions, these juicy questions as well, I think, and really thinking about, well, what could our purpose be then if this other purpose is sort of, you know, at my human core, like completely out of integrity.
Thank you, Roberto. May a financial organization even imagine something that is not making more money?
Yeah, but I think this is for sure a quick question, and I perceive in a growing interest from companies regarding these issues. But it's clear that in a world that is still oriented toward economic results, and increasingly infrequent questions, not only how we could guarantee these results over time in a more sustainable way, because sometimes you know that is a sort of greenwashing, but how we could or should change our footprint in a stable way in the ecosystem in which we are. This is really more and more than to be more sustainable or to be more green. This is to a matter of mindset, I think, because on the one hand, it's a matter of knowledge of what it means, for instance, to be truly ESG beyond the fashion trends, or to become a benefit corporation. I think it's above all a strategic matter in finding the ways, in changing the footprint, in changing the way we are serving a community, in particular as a financial institution. And I think that not only to guarantee the future results, but above all to find a new position in the ecosystem, include the social dimension of what we are saying about who we are, about not only our reputation, I think, because the world, it's a matter of fact, it is more and more sensitive to this term, in particular when we talk about financial institution, obviously. And finally, talking about people, I think this is really a matter that it's a matter of fact that the new generation, the new people that are entering the companies tend to choose the employers on the basis of their ability to be attractive with a real value proposition, with a coherent narrative, even before the salary, the career that they can guarantee. And this coherence cannot be made up of a declaration, cannot be made up of, let's say, institutional advertising. We have to be really coherent, a day-by-day behavior we put in practice, I think.
Dave, do we have hope?
There's a book by Terry Eagleton on recommending people, well, two books by Terry on recommending to people at the moment. One is called Radical Sacrifice, because as a species, if we don't make radical sacrifices soon, it's all over anyway. And the other one is Hope Without Optimism. And that actually goes back to a key concept from Moltmann, who a lot of us studied in the 70s, on the theology of hope. Yeah, to abandon hope is a mortal sin in Catholicism, and rightly so, right? But it doesn't, having hope doesn't require you to be optimistic. It requires you to be pragmatic. Yeah? I think there's a couple of broad things I want to say. I mean, I think Roberto's completely right on one thing and wrong on another, so I'll do the right first. Increasingly, companies are finding it difficult to retain staff if they don't have some basic ethics. I've been working in one of the big oil companies, and they're having a huge problem in getting engineering stuff because nobody wants to be sitting in a pub saying they work for an oil company. Because the consequence of the hire, particularly young people. So we are seeing switches there, and there are sort of ways on that. So I agree on that. I think the two things I disagree on is, I think if you have to write a purpose statement, then you're doomed to purposelessness for the rest of your life. There's an old session in anthropology: if you ever write your values down, you just lost them. Because writing them down makes them explicit and gameable. And the other point, which I think is important to understand, is that culture is an emergent property of things that we do. It's not something which has causal power. It's actually, and one of the big things we saw with the cybernetics driven stuff over the last 30 years is the confusion of properties with causes. So we observe a property of something, and we say, oh, if we can have that, like creativity, then somehow or other we'll have, and it doesn't work that way around, right? I think there are three big overriding things. One is, and it's coming up in the chat, all right, the dominance of what's called social atomism in political science, i.e. the entire focus on the individual, which is Northern European and North American. It's not Western. It actually goes largely with the dominant mercantile Protestant nations. That's where it comes from, and the individual relationship with God, and they all sort of come together. You actually see what's called communitarianism in Scandinavia, in the Celtic countries, in Southern Europe, in Africa and Asia. So that concept that the community is more important than the individual, and individuals get meaning as a result of their membership of a community, actually is much better neurobiology. It's kind of like we evolved as clans, not as tribes. We evolved to live in clans and extended families. So I think that's one of the big switches, and I think the sort of hit on neoliberalism is helpful there, right? So that's kind of like one big thing. I think the other big thing is time horizon. We don't have the time, to waste anymore. I mean, if you look on global warming, I mean, one of the things I and others have been arguing for some time is we really need a major push on things which will give us another 20 or 30 years breathing space. So things like refreezing the poles are probably more important than the Paris Accord. It's not the Paris Accord isn't important, but it's a big thing. It will take years to put into place. Until the micro level of people's day-to-day lives changes, it won't work anyway, because politicians won't make the decisions. So things like geoengineering the poles, which is now an engineering problem, not a physics problem, would make a difference. And so we're not dealing with those as a species well, because everything is being left to individual countries and individual agencies. Britain leaving Europe is yet just another disaster of fragmentation. In that respect, and the inability to operate together is there, right? And then I think the third thing is the whole issue about money, to be honest, and the blockchain is no different. I've done a lot of work in indigenous communities where they have what's called gifting. Now, and actually the Middle East used to work like this as well. I remember I first got my first job in HR as it happened. And somebody said, oh, you've worked in the Middle East, you know the difference between a bribe and a gift. I just remember rolling with laughter and say, yes, I know. Yes, I do. But, I can't explain it. And the trouble is, from a Western liberal perspective, we see gifts as bribes, although we don't see going to the same golf club as a bribe. I mean, it's quite interesting. We have our own forms of that sort of trusted validation that are just more explicit. So a gift is actually an entry fee. It's not an exchange. And that's really important to understand. It's not a favor bank. And there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't, as a species, give free at the point of entry healthcare and education to everybody. We just choose to ration it with money. Right now, I think one thing that COVID has done is to say that actually, if you look at what governments are spending at the moment, kind of like money is not a problem, right? I mean, it's going to be if we carry on with the current way we deal with things. But the reality is, as a species, we can put things together and we can do things. Why we have to mediate everything with little green pieces of paper, I think is part of the problem.
I tend to agree, I must say. Thank you all. I would like to pass the word to Simone for a couple of reflections maybe, and then we'll open up to the rest of the room for some more interaction. Simone.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was an exciting hour, I would say. I really appreciate the reflections that we have been able to share. And I think I'm really, again, thankful for your time and for the time of all the people that are in the Zoom room with us and on the YouTube channel. One thing that I wanted, a couple of things for our audience. First of all, again, we're going to have the Q&A soon. So now, from now on, we suggest that you can also open your cam if you want to be more present in the conversation, or also at least visually, I would say. And then maybe after 1 hour, you can also stretch a little bit, because, maybe at least for me, there was this sense of, I needed a stretch. So anybody that wants to do that, I think I really suggest it. In terms of reflection that I can offer, I think I really want to build on Dave's points. That I think the interesting thing that we have on the table is recognizing this nexus. Like Dave called it during our podcast. We speak about an inflection point when we on the white paper, and I think we are at multiple inflection points. So a question is to recognize it, and to some extent to acknowledge that what organization was until now, what the organization was until now is not going to be the same in the future. So how we think about organizing in the future is going to be radically different. And therefore, I think we need to really be ready to embrace really radically different ways of organizing. And the question that I think it's also interesting to reflect upon once now that we are going to have this half an hour of conversation around the questions, is that what also Dave again spoke with me about during the podcast, when I think and also Alicia Enig that is in the chat today with us, we spoke about this in the podcast as well. So this idea that you need to educate to what Dave is called the virtue ethics. So it feels like this future we're talking about in terms of organizing sounds like samurais, sounds like being really, I would say, into this with 100% of what we are. And it means also learning to relate in a radically different way, and much more open, and much more collaborative, and much more, I would say, empathic as well. And it also deals with this idea of the need to build communities around these challenges, these new ways of organizing in radical complexity. And I think this finally connects with the question of entanglement that we also discussed with Dave, but also with Alicia and other guests in our podcast, that is about how the organization reconnects with the community and the landscape, for example. And this means that essentially, for example, the way we do manufacturing is going to change radically. The way we do, I don't know, food and we build clothing, these kind of things, these economies of essentials need to be redefined and reinvented. Not just about how we connect with I don't know, the celebrities to get a video call on our birthday date. So that's the point I think we need to acknowledge, and that's going to be very challenging and interesting as a question for us designers, organizers, and but the question is, are we ready to measure with this? That's, I think, a reflection that I would like to share with you. Then I leave it to you, Emanuele, for the question.
Yeah, let me share the questions that we got, and for our friends in the room, please keep sending them and voting if you want to add. Let me know if you can see it. Let's start from the most voted ones. So the first one we got is this one, and I will invite the person submitting it to clarify if he or she wants to do that. It's likely leaders will not lead the pack. That leaves professions and disciplines to step up. Is there a segment in the ecosystem that holds the most potential to challenge the status quo? And actually, I guess the next one also is connected. For example, enterprise architects, organizational development professionals, and coaches are charged with change. Might there be a segment that could be shepherded? Who wants to take it?
That was my question, and so my impression is, and it's been verified by this conversation, is that those the people who are most, I guess, embedded in the status quo are not likely going to be the ones who are going to accept the radical paradigm shift. So, is there a segment that that we could possibly shepherd to actually start cooperating together? I mean, part of the issue I see is that we go in and say this to corporations: if we have internal and external architects and OD people who are still patronizing the old message, then it tends to fall on deaf ears. So
Yeah.
I was just looking for a way to build some momentum.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, can I on this, because
Please.
it's very interesting the fact that you're mentioning enterprise architects, organizational development professional, etc. Because I don't come from study on organizational development or organizational design, but I noticed in my journey through digital transformation, so through transformation of an organization, how important these competencies are and how they're actually rare, even among HR professionals. So your question is very interesting, because I think we need a lot more than this, okay? And we need also these coming out of the silos in which they're embedded, because to be fair, I've seen often in my experience that if you get an enterprise architect and an organizational design expert to talk about it, they seem to come from two different planets, even if at the end, they should be talking about the essence of the organization. So definitely that's something that probably we need to think of, and we need to think of, you know, it's interesting. David before mentioned about what is the role of consultants. Okay, now all these roles very often are internal consultants, and internal consultants are very often a lot more butterflies. Okay, just because they are not given the power to make things change. Okay, and yes, you can have a lot of influence and skill, but very often it's difficult for them to really then make the change happen. And this is something that, so the question is more, how do we get leaders to understand that these competencies, for example, the OD part, is part of what they need to be equipped to actually make the organization succeed? Probably I have not answered the question. I'm just underlying that this is even more important, and we need to get OD, etc., probably a little bit out of a too academic corner that it went on a little bit in the past years. Because one of the problems that I noticed, and to be fair, there are some of the professional organizations here that have been doing a lot of good work here. What I was referring in my first intervention is exactly that. Very often there is a lot of very interesting academic research, but it's really written just for the academics. And companies don't get to that. Companies and organizations don't get that and don't understand it, even if when they start reading it. And this is something that we need also to make through and be a little bit more in disseminating a lot of this knowledge around.
Thank you.
I mean, I'd like, sorry,
please go ahead.
Was that go ahead or not?
Yes, it was.
Okay, I think there's a couple of things which are important here. One is, I think the role of architecture is actually, I think, one of the big things coming, and particularly we need to start to see technology architecture and business architecture and market architecture as the same discipline. I mean, I was arguing back in the 90s in corporate committees that people are objects too. And, you know, they have input, output, they have inheritance, they have polymorphism, and you need to start to design systems so that people and technology interact and the applications are in emergent properties of those interaction. And I think that's now coming, right? I think that, so the role of architect is going to be even more important. That links in with scaffolding. I think the problem with OD is not that they're too academic, but they're not academic in the right ways. I mean, OD is still stuck in Freud and Jung, and the rest of us moved on from that decades ago. I mean, it's just bad science, right? And you get all these self-referential sort of papers using esoteric language, which, you know, you can shoot into flames the minute you go in with anything which is real, right? And I've said for years that OD departments actually have the CEO in a Stockholm Syndrome relationship, in that he doesn't realize, or she doesn't realize, that they could change things because OD have got this huge infrastructure of process, yeah, which stops it, right? And I think the key thing on leadership is to understand there are different times. So this is Cynefin, all right? So if the situation is complicated, then that's when your professionals come in, because you have a body of knowledge, you know the entries into that, you can know you work on it. But professionals are the most conservative bloody people in the world. I mean, you try and publish an article in a professional journal which challenges orthodoxy, and you won't see life for dust, right? The professions are more conservative often than dictatorial leaders, in fact, right? So inattentional blindness is a universal. I think there's a case for bureaucracy. And there's this huge case for silos. I mean, the first person I could find to complain about silos was Zeno, the tyrant of Athens. So we've been complaining about this for several thousand years and nothing has changed. So maybe we should start to realize silos have functionality. The issue is, how do you entangle them? Silos allow you to hold knowledge at a high level of abstraction and codification, and you can't do that in cross-silo working. You just dumb things down. So, and you know, if you look in a crisis, I mean, look at the difference on leadership. I mean, the New Zealand Prime Minister locked everything down. She gave herself breathing space. She made the right decisions early, and it's interesting. It's what we're recommending. Even if you don't think it's the right thing, if it's going to give you breathing space, you do it anyway. You don't wait to know it's the right thing, because then you haven't got breathing space, which is what happened in the States and the UK. And during a crisis, people want leaders. They want people to look up to. And the big message we're giving on this is centralized coordination, distributed decision-making. Your role as a leader in a crisis is to coordinate, not to decide. Yeah, if you have to decide, it's a sort of decision of last resort. So we need, and crews, if you look at the military use crews. A sergeant can outvote a general in certain contexts. Yeah, a sergeant who's a pilot on a bomber outranks a general who's a navigator while the plane is flying. So crews have roles and role function defined, and crews have capability. There's always a pilot, but who the pilot can change. So we need to stop these binaries, all right? It's like, oh, we need servant leaders. No, we don't need servant leaders. Sometimes leaders need to be servants, but we don't need everything to be certain levers. I mean, these sort of universal prescriptions and pendulums are kind of like really bad, different things work in different contexts. We've very rarely invented anything in an organization which didn't have utility in context. I make exceptions for that for Six Sigma and SAFe, which are beyond belief that anybody could ever adopt them. But in general, most things have value. We just take them too far.
So there are some interesting comments and different views in the chat. So I invite you to read there as well. And just for a matter of time, actually, I would like to address some more questions. And actually, the next one is for Dave as well. And I will ask you to be brief. Who posted this question?
I did.
If you want to read it.
I think I'll rephrase it given what you just said, but you say very clearly you want to distribute sensing and ideation, but not decision. And now I heard this further distinction between decision and coordination, and I'll definitely want to ask you to elaborate on that, because that's really the question. Because I also heard you speak about disruption, and that means they're small emergent entities, and how can they harmonize, coordinate, not necessarily relying on the same action, same vision, but make sure that their actions reinforce one another to achieve whatever goals they have, given that we don't necessarily, well, I mean, what is the difference here between coordinating and deciding? I mean, if they exist as separate, they don't have coordinated decision, yet you speak of the value of coordination. So
if you're a leader in a crisis, every time you make a decision, you're hanging yourself out to get it wrong. The one thing in a crisis you can guarantee is most decisions will be wrong. So don't make them as a leader. Get other people to make them and coordinate it and reflect and reallocate resources and protect people. Yeah, that's kind of like, that's that principle, all right? And somebody has got to focus on connecting things, and that's your role. Because you're in the center, you can see the big picture. You haven't got time to make the micro decisions. You know, leaders who try and micromanage always fail. Yeah, you have to give a sense of direction. So, for example, if we're doing a map, all right, let's take the stuff we've done on citizen engagement. We'll use children as ethnographers, and we'll capture people's stories, and then we'll look at the patterns in those stories, and we'll say to the community, how would you create more stories like this and fewer like that? How they do that is their own affair. We give a sense of direction, right? And that's what I mean partly by distributed decision-making. But the key thing in distributed situational assessment is people can't know what the right answer is. It's why questionnaires don't work. It's why polls don't work, because people respond in role, right? So we use high abstraction metadata for that, right? So nobody knows what the right answer is. We get quant data because only quant scales. We draw maps, and then you give a sense of direction. Then you delegate to people, you know, here's the map for your territory. We want more of these, fewer of that. Go do it. Right? But each map, of course, is slightly different. So although you've got the big picture, you're moving in different directions.
So centralized map making. Thank you.
Okay, moving to the next one. Actually, it's for Dave again. It's from Greta. Dave, if you could talk about acceptation briefly.
Okay, so acceptation, sorry about that. Somebody will pick it up shortly. Okay, they have. Acceptation is what happens in a trait which evolves for one function and the conditions of stress will exact for another. So we know, for example, that all dinosaurs had feathers and that they were colorful. That's come out of northern China of recent years. And some of those dinosaurs developed skin flaps on their forelimbs to better display their feathers. And those dinosaurs ran fast, and that meant they glided. So that's how we got flight. Yeah, so and the cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved to manipulate muscles in fingers. It accepts in humans to manage grammar in language. So grammar is too big a step for a linear process. It requires a non-linear acceptive process. Right? Now you can take other examples. So IBM was the world leader in punch card control of industrial machines, and they repurposed that to give them dominance of computing. There was something they were really good at, which could be repurposed quickly for something else. Yeah, Apple did the same. Apple are masters of this. If you look at Apple's innovations, they're constantly repurposing things for completely novel purposes. So they don't have all the grief of the development because the thing already works. They're just repurposing it. And that's called adaptive innovation. And by the way, the whole pharmaceutical industry is totally dependent on it. It's why weak signal detection and side effects are so critical to monitor, because they're the opportunity for novelty.
Thank you, Dave. Taking the next one, maybe, I don't know, Sergio or Roberto, if you want to take this one. What is the role of leadership in this conversation? So designing organizations for a changing world.
So I think that in general, we tend to consider leadership sometimes, as I said, we learn in the classrooms or something that is related to some policies, how to be a good leader. As I said, I think leadership, a part of the idea of servant leadership that Dave mentioned before, is to be it's about inspiration, more or less. First of all, it's about to connect a different point of view. It's for sure in the traditional organization means to lead resources in general to achieve a result. But first of all, I think in these times, we need to consider the leadership something really beyond the traditional idea of leadership we have, or better, the traditional idea of leadership we in the HR have. And that's the reason why I think we need to embrace this idea of a strong diversity, a strong in a really diverse point of view, in accepting into be in invaded new fields, into be invading by different thoughts. I'm aware that it's so difficult to accept, considering the traditional point of view, considering the mainstream culture in the company. But this is my idea of leadership. Is at the end of the day, sometimes to lose the control. It is really tricky in an organization, or is a tricky for a leader that is mainly a manager than the leader. Losing the control, I think today is really important. This is probably a new way of considering the leadership in these hard times.
Lisa, is there anything you want to add on this?
Yeah, well, I think I wrote in the chat there a quote that I like is that power is like fertilizer. You know, when it's concentrated, it can be suffocating, but when it's distributed, it contributes to growth. And I think designing organizations for distributed leadership is hard. And I think in regards to that first question as well, I think that there's a shift that's needed in both directions in order to create leaderful organizations. So Mickey Kashtan talked about this when I interviewed her for the podcast, that people who have power or who have had power, there needs to be a shift in them in terms of, you know, unlearning a lot of this top-down kind of behavior that we've been conditioned into. But also for people who haven't had power historically, you know, employees, you could say, there needs to be a huge shift as well, that it really takes a lot of courage and practice and space and time and patience and safety for those people to practice and learn to step up, to not defer, to make proposals, to challenge and question things, to sort of be responsible for, you know, I'm at the moment really interested in building the capacity for everyone to transform conflicts instead of seeing that as something that you have to escalate to your manager or HR or something, which comes back to my point before about relational. So leadership for me is a really interesting topic. And I think we need lots of different kinds of leaders. So I agree with Dave in what he said before, that sometimes it's very appropriate to kind of be directive as a leader, and we need that. And we also need many more leaders who are sort of coaching and not just technical experts, or, you know, kind of dismantling this myth that to be a good leader, I need to know all the answers, or I need to give solutions and advice all the time. That actually it's much more about being catalytic. But it's not only that, it's allowing for dynamic hierarchies of lots of different kinds of leaders, I think.
Yep. Let's see if we can cover a couple more. This one is about another constraining paradigm, embedded win-lose paradigm. I want to talk about that. Is this limiting us?
I think you've got a danger here, right? I mean, first of all, I just don't like the mindset word, just to be clear. There ain't such a thing as a mindset. Right? What there are patterns of understanding in society which we get swept up in. You know, the thing that people, it's not somebody's individual mind which is wrong. It's the collective narrative which creates a whirlpool effect of which they're a part. And we should stop using the word mindset because it gets us focused. It tries to make people guilty. Oh, you haven't got an agile mindset. Well, bugger off, right? You actually haven't got agile processes yet. So how the hell can I have a mindset associated, right? And you've taken the question off the screen, right? So could you put it back up briefly?
Let me try, since I put it as answered. So let me find if I can do that.
Just remind me what it was then, because it was
the war.
The war one. I think again, this is a both and, not an either or. I think this is the classic approach. Every time you come to discussions, everybody wants everything they don't like in the past to be abandoned and some wonderful new state to be achieved. Right? You're not going to get rid of war. All right. It means you can mitigate it. I mean, I do a lot of work on peace and conflict resolution. And we may be about to start a massive project in the States post the election. And what we'll be looking for is a micro narrative level, yeah, at which people are capable of having an agreement and identifying where they can't disagree. The whole process of bringing people into workshops and saying you shouldn't have a war mindset and you should all love each other and all get on together has never worked in the history of humanity. It just increases conflict. If you want a satire on it, look at Derry Girls, which is probably one of the best comedies to come out of Britain in recent years, and look at episode 1 of series 2. And it's the best satire on conflict resolution by getting everybody together and saying, please love each other and stop fighting, all right? The reality is we will fight. There's a principle here called coherent heterogeneity. So give my standard example on that. I'm not wearing my blue Cardiff shirt today. I'll be wearing that on Sunday because we're playing a rugby match, right? Now, Cardiff Rugby Club are a highly civilized club. We play by the rules. We're constantly cheated by referees. yeah, we have a good pitch and we're worthy of support, right? There are those bastards down the road in Llanelli who play in red shirts, who cheat constantly, can't be trusted with the ball and basically foul, right? But when the English arrive, we're all Welsh. All right, now, the point is humans actually are quite good at managing conflict without it being destructive, right? So the issue is not how we get rid of conflict, because conflict is needed. It's how we make conflict non-destructive and how we find ways in which we can align. So if you look at the climate change movement at the moment, it's fragmented over ideology in the face of a major crisis. The ideology doesn't bloody matter. If they'll cooperate with you on something, yeah, get them to do it. But there's one whole section of the climate change movement that won't accept that anybody can be serious about climate change unless they're also into Black Lives Matter and they're liberation socialists. And the point is, it doesn't matter. Climate change is bigger than those issues in terms of where it's going. And you've got to find ways in which you can have conflict, which isn't destructive, and you can align when you need to.
Okay, maybe let me take just the last one briefly, and then let's open up to you guys for a comment from everybody that wants to briefly add his thoughts. I find this one quite interesting. The forces of the existing paradigm are strong. Why, how would more radical change happen now? I think it really summarizes a bit what we are facing. So, any thought about fostering radical change?
Maybe if I can offer a quick, I would say, nudge. I recall during our event in July, John Robb said, it's not what we want, but it's what's happening. So the question is, it's happening already. It's not about the forces that are going to, resist. Maybe that's the topic, right?
Any other comment? I know that somebody out is not in agreement with this.
Well, I guess it depends on how optimistic or pessimistic you are. So I know, like Margaret Wheatley talks about, it's too late, that we've gone off the edge of a cliff, and the best we can do is sort of find what she calls islands of sanity, or we could say islands of clarity. So I have days where I think, we're not going to be able to do enough to shift this paradigm in time, perhaps, but it's still important to try and do the work that you're doing with the people around you, with kind of faith that it matters. And in my more optimistic days, I hope that enough little ripples are happening that it might shift. And sometimes these things shift and tip more quickly. So yeah, I'm kind of hopeful, but
that's one of the problems with Meg Wheatley, because she writes beautifully and she has these wonderful visions of how things should be, and then it doesn't happen, and it was never going to happen. And then she writes a book which is one of the most black books of despair I've read in my life, right? And that's what happens if you're too idealistic. All right, and it's the big problem, all right? I for my many and various sins, I've had to read Trump's tweets every morning for the last 4 years, and for a project I'm involved in. And he uses words to trigger what are called tropes or attractors. Yeah, and every time somebody argues against him, they make it worse, not better. Yeah, Obama actually said this in one way the other day, that populists arise on the back of uneducated, white, working class males who think they've been disenfranchised. Yeah? And you've got to address that. You've got to address where people are, not by telling them where you think they should be, but by taking them from where they are in a better direction.
I don't know. I feel a bit compelled to foster this. How do we call it in the question? The more radical change. I had plenty of discussions with Otti as well about this responsibility. Where is this sitting? If we need to do anything about that, or just let it emerge. I don't know. I think it's an open topic. I would like to close this wonderful conversation, leaving the space for anybody else in the room that wants to open the mic and comment. So Otti, Alicia, Susan, Mark. I know you have lots of ideas, and all the others that didn't open the cam. If they want to jump in, please briefly do that before we reach the end.
I'll take the bait.
Please.
So yes, Dave, I agree that war is sometimes an only option, but I also think that we as a species have only learned how to be at war, how to be in conflict, and so there's another option that I want to say it was the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. There is another option called win-win or no deal. And if people would just turn off Trump, he would go away. So we don't always have to fight. And that was, quite frankly, as an entrepreneur, a very difficult lesson for me. But at the bottom of this is that if we don't learn how to negotiate, then then people are just going to they're going to talk with their feet and default to war. So I think that there is something to say about coming from a abundance win-win mindset or paradigm or whatever you want to call it. It's an embedded way of being that I think stops a lot of cooperation and collaboration and progress.
It's also true that the lack of cartilage in my knees stops an awful lot of progress going down mountains. But I can't do anything about it, so I've got to learn to live with it. All right? I mean, I think this is the constraint point. You've got to work out what constraints you can change. So there is a significant part of the population you can get into a win-win negotiation mode, so you do that. But you don't then say everybody has to be like that, because then you end up litigating and nothing changes. The whole point here is, and the point I'm trying to make is, you've got to deal with where people are and move them, not say how they should be. And the minute you start to say everything should be like this, you set yourself up for failure. The minute you say, well, could we just go here, guys? You're not doing that.
And that's what negotiation is. And quite frankly, I'm totally agree with you. And the sad thing is the people who don't want to change, there's nothing we can do for them. We need to have a space for hospice for business, because they're going over the cliff. And that's good news, because that's going to clean out the forest and leave the sunshine for the companies that are willing to.
And sorry, Susan, I think that's actually really dangerous, because they'll take people with them, and the earth is so bloody fragile at the moment. We can't go through chaos to come out the other side. Yeah, you've got to find ways to bound or mitigate. You've got to create resilience with how people are, right? So if they're going to have conflict, you have to deflect the conflict, or you have to focus it on something which doesn't provide material harm. Yeah, you don't tell them what. It's all about changing the process and changing the interaction.
And that's what negotiation is, and that's what's not happening. So I agree. And the best way sometimes to deflect is just to move on.
Thank you. I think all we are just 2 minutes from the top of the hour, so 2 hours after the beginning. I think it has been an amazing conversation with lots of also different points of view. Probably we are not in agreement about everything, and that's good. I don't know if that's conflict, probably it's or negotiation, but I think it's richness for sure. And I will leave space to Simone, just to, if you want to close. You're on mute.
Right, thanks. So as I said, basically I wanted to try to be on time, to be not Italian for once, and I will try to do that. So essentially, we wrote this piece of work that is being the place where we are hosting this discussion, these amazing conversations, and it's about acknowledging we are at this inflection point between what our advisor Lisa calls the no more and the not yet. I think we are really enjoying being in this place with you, with our community. with our guests. And I think I'm really thankful again for having you today with us. What's coming up? We're going to prototype new tools thanks to these conversations, thanks to the research. We are developing some kind of pedagogic process that is easier to onboard, because this is a conversation that needs to be open to everybody and needs to be about how we organize a scale all over the world in collaboration, in conversation. And we're going to expand the research and iterate on the tools with regards to the E3O, the EEEO, the Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Enabling Organization theory that we are somehow unearthing with our community along these weeks and months. So coming up, there is a possibility to be with us to learn our methodologies in February. So check it out on the website, and let's continue with this journey all together. And again, thanks very much for everybody that had the patience to be with us for almost 2 hours today. And really thankful for everybody that showed up, for those that have been able to speak, for those that have been sitting in the backgrounds. I think I really look forward to reconnect with you in the near future. Thanks so much, everybody. And let's close the webinar here. Emanuele, do you want to add something more?
No, I just really want to thank Dave, Roberto, Sergio, and Lisa for spending time with us, and all of our other friends in the room and on YouTube. Thank you so much, and talk to you soon.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.